we can get started. I think enough people are in the room where we can keep going. So thank you one and all for showing up to our event today, The Power of Empowering Your SDRs. I'm going to start off with a bit of housekeeping, introduce myself. My name's AJ. I head up marketing here at demandDrive, and I'll be kind of moderating the discussion a little bit, but the show is really going to be on Lindsay and Jessica and having them kind of talk through the topic for today. This is being recorded, so if you're watching this at a later date, thank you. Good to see you. So if you have to drop off at some point early, no worries, we can get you the recording. And we are planning on taking some time at the end for Q&A. So we've got Alex and AC from demandDrive and ANNUITAS respectively on the back end, who are going to be liaisoning between you, the audience, and us on the panel. So if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If they're especially juicy, I think Alex will try to interrupt us and have us answer live, but we will save like 10 to 15 minutes at the end to cover anything that pops up. So you guys ready?
Ready.
Awesome.
Ready.
So today, broadly speaking, we're talking about the SDRs at a lot of organizations and how undervalued and overlooked they are. Realistically, they are a lot more valuable than most people give them credit for, both on a quantitative side of things and a qualitative side of things. So we're going to be talking through how you can really get your SDRs to make an impact at your organization, why a lot of teams aren't doing that today, and what your organization could look like with an empowered SDR function. But before we get into all of that, let's have the panel introduce themselves really quickly. So a bit of background about who you two are, where you work, what you do. Lindsay, I'll start with you because you're right below me on my screen. Give the audience an idea of who you are.
Well, I've already gone through my food preferences, so we can skip that part. But I'm Lindsay Fry. I'm one of the co-founders of demandDrive. And demandDrive, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we help B2B tech companies build and manage sales development teams. So a lot of experience over the last 11 years helping clients of all shapes and sizes to build and manage their SDR strategy and their team. So looking forward to chatting with everybody today.
Hi, I'm Jessica Jones. I'm the Chief Growth Officer for ANNUITAS. I came up through the organization actually in client delivery as a VP of strategy. So I've been on the delivery side, and now that helps me in terms of understanding how to work with organizations and identify what their lowest hanging fruit and their needs are around demand process. But as far as ANNUITAS, what we like to say is that we help organizations operationalize their go-to-market around customer journey. So really bringing customer journey to life and how you're changing your go-to-market and putting in sustainable processes and programs to ultimately help sales lift.
Love it. Very appropriate experiences for what we're going to be talking about today. And I want to start the discussion off with a look at why this is an issue. Why are we even talking about this? Really poke the bear a little bit and get into the weeds of like, why aren't companies investing in their SDR functions? There's a general reluctance, I would say, maybe not so much now as it was a year ago, but there's still plenty of companies who really shirk the SDR responsibility in terms of managing and giving them what they need to succeed. Why is that the case? What have we done historically to have this be a problem before we can even start tackling the solution? So Lindsay, we can start with you on this and get your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a couple good points there. One, it does seem over the last couple of years that organizations are more apt to adopt sort of an SDR team, or at least start thinking about that. But there are still a lot of organizations that, whether they think it's too daunting or they don't feel that it's necessary. I think there's a few reasons for that. I'll talk to organizations who, assume that their account executives and their sales teams should do the prospecting and that should do sort of full sales cycle. And that's what they're paid for, and that should be part of the sales function. And, I talked to them about why, it is actually a very different skill set, and you should have your, highly paid account executives focused on near-term sort of down funnel opportunities versus sort of the, sustainable, consistent prospecting that an SDR function can do. I think also the profile of most SDRs, there's certainly outliers, but usually this is a role that folks early in their career take, and it's usually a launch pad into a lot of different things, right? Either someone, takes an SDR role because they want to become an account executive, or they want to move into client success or marketing. So, somebody's tenure as an SDR really is a year or two before they're looking to make that next step. So there is a lot of natural churn and turnover in the SDR role, and that can be really challenging for an organization who, wants to sort of mitigate turnover and understand sort of the cost of that. So those are a couple reasons why I think organizations might, shirk away from adopting an SDR team.
It's interesting, building on that too. We have a lot of organizations that are in industries that I would say they consider themselves to be complex. So you think about high tech, you think about life sciences, things like that. And I think that people don't think that somebody, building on what you said, that's straight out of college, or this might be their first job, can have those technical deep dive conversations with prospects coming in, whether inbound or even an outbound conversation, I would say more so. But it's interesting because in my past, I've built SDR teams, and I have an SDR now, right? Actually through you guys, which is great. But my two best SDRs have been people that had zero experience whatsoever in sales, hands down, best SDRs. I think there's a lot of intangibles that make SDRs really good. I hate to say the it factor because a lot of people use that, but it really is. There's an it factor. It really is. In SDR, that you just have to have an eye for it, but they don't need that technical skill. And frankly, they shouldn't be having those types of conversations that early either, right? So I would say if that's a great indicator that that person is ready to buy, if they want to go ahead and have that deeper dive around the product or the service that you're selling, and therefore you should be passing that to a sales rep, not having that conversation or trying to yourself if you don't have the skill set.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think in my view, a SDR team should be able to open up conversations with the right people, the right companies, and articulate a value proposition, kind of understand the typical use cases. And then when that prospect expresses an interest, or there's sort of a challenge that can be solved by the solution or product, then that's when the SDR should sort of kick that over to the sales team, who, to your point, Jessica, is going to be far more effective at sort of navigating through objections and answering questions and things like that. So I think that's a really good point.
I think recently too, I've seen a lot of organizations hesitant because of the way that people have been moving jobs so frequently, right? So they think about having somebody that can coach and understand internally how to manage and coach that team. And so we're seeing a lot of people very hesitant because leadership is jumping all over the place because good talent's hard to find, right? So they're getting poached, they're getting significantly higher offers than they're making today. And so losing that talent and having that internal talent to be able to train and manage those teams effectively is something else that we're seeing personally a big challenge with a lot of our clients.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of organizations that I'm talking to are expressing as a big challenge. Like, we can't hire fast enough sometimes, right? That maybe they do want an SDR team in-house, but they can't find the right people, or they may have hired a few people and then 6 months later, 2 of them quit. So now they're down to 1 lone SDR. And the other point I think too is to what you said, Jessica, is you need somebody who's dedicated to this team to manage them and to do that effectively, who knows how to build, compensation plans and the right incentive strategy, and can coach these folks, because to our point, they tend to be earlier in their career. They need support. They need the right resources. They need somebody who they can go to. And I think a lot of times if it's sort of an afterthought, like, oh, maybe we'll try an SDR too, we'll hire a couple people, they'll roll up to the VP of sales. That individual a lot of times can't give them the care and coaching that they need.
They're not committed to it.
Successful.
Yeah, they just have too much on their plate, or they don't have a process in place, right? So they don't have a standardized process that's repeatable and scalable. So it's more institutional knowledge that literally when that person does leave, that's in leadership, the process leaves with them, right? Because it's in their heads, or it's something that they were doing on the fly or iterating, right? So it's not something that's standardized, repeatable, predictable for them to follow and be able to train and manage and scale up very easily around.
Yeah, absolutely. They'll do a good job with the product training piece of it, right? But the actual prospecting piece of it and training, sort of the SDR 101 and the coaching there, they likely won't have that built out. So yeah, that's a great point too.
I think you both touched on a lot realistically, and there is a lot of reasons as to why companies don't look at their SDR function as a way of sustainably generating results. There's a lot of volatility around it. They're young. It's difficult to manage. I think we produced a piece a while ago satirically about like, why would you ever want to manage an SDR team? Like it's difficult. There's a lot of moving pieces, and typically the moving pieces of people associated with the
That's
role
right.
are incredibly difficult to manage and make sure that you can attribute any type of success to the role based on like what you're trying to accomplish as a manager or a director within an organization. Um,
Yeah.
you also both brought up something that I wanted to dive a bit deeper into, the idea being that a lot of organizations might look at the role because it's so volatile and you might have 4 reps one day and 0 the
Yeah.
next. The idea that you can just burn and churn through the position and just replace SDRs like that. You both brought up the idea that like the process is really the key there. And if you don't have a set process to plug somebody in and have them ramp up quickly, you can't do that. And I think that a lot of people think they have that process and maybe they don't, and they start to realize as they onboard new SDRs the challenges associated with that. Could either one of you kind of dive a bit more into that, into some experience that you've had with that, or what a really good, I guess, like onboarding process should look like, so that when you do have that come up and you're like, oh, I've got this down pat, you actually do, and you're not just wasting money.
Right. No, that's a great point. And I think it really starts with, and Jessica, you alluded to this earlier, with the recruiting and recruiting sort of the right intangibles. So obviously the right background for sure, but keep in mind that SDRs tend to be early in their career. They may be right out of school. They may have had one prior job that was a little bit unrelated. So the first thing is recruiting the right skills and the right sort of intangibles. So we look for things like coachability, intellectual curiosity, any type of relevant past experience, someone who's competitive, someone who has a growth mindset,
Problem solvers.
problem solver, good communicator. So those types of things, obvious. And I know like the it factor, but it really does matter. And Jessica and I have, we've helped support you from an SDR standpoint, and it's mostly worked out, but there's times we've had to pivot a little bit to find like the right person for ANNUITAS, and also sort of the right person for this position. So that's before you even get to onboarding, you want to make sure you're onboarding the right types of people. And then I think just making sure you have somebody who is going to be managing that onboarding process, that sort of leader, that kind of coach or sales development manager. And that and again, like I see a lot of organizations who put a lot of emphasis on the product training, the solution training on the service and the product, and spending weeks around that. Whereas it's important, right? You have to understand the industry, you have to understand the personas and what they care about, but it's really what's most important is how do you open up a call? How do you close for a meeting? How do you answer common objections? That's what an SDR needs to do. So creating sort of training and onboarding around that, I think is really crucial, in making sure you have someone that's well-versed to do that. I don't know if I exactly answered your question, AJ. I may have gone off on a bit of a tangent, but I think recruiting for the right kind of profile of SDR is really, really important.
I think alignment too is really key around qualification criteria, around understanding what the charter of the SDR is within the organization, right? Organizations are going to approach it in different ways, depending if it's inbound or outbound. How sophisticated their marketing is, how much information you're providing to your SDRs on those calls, especially for inbound leads, what the expectation is to do with that. I think key KPIs is a big thing too. We oftentimes see a lot of disconnects between activity-based motions, things that are more backwards looking, I'd say, rather than key KPIs that you're aligned to within the organization, right? So what does success look like? Yep. And being really clear about that upfront and aligning with that across the organization, and bringing folks in, right? And understanding like those relationships you have with each one of the regions or BUs or whatever it is, and building those relationships is going to be really key as well, so that people trust you and they trust that the leads coming from you are quality, and that they should equate those to the leads that they're working on or bringing into the organization themselves. That's something that we see a lot, is that where kind of coming from behind, right? So they may have tried an SDR team in the past, or maybe it's actually reflective of the way they feel about marketing, if it's an inbound motion that they're supporting. And so that disconnect between sales and marketing will bleed over into the SDR, and we'll see a lot of lead leakage in the beginning, right? Where the SDR is doing a great job, but maybe sales isn't paying attention to it because in the past they've been doing the qualification themselves, or everything's being hucked over the fence. We all know that drill, right? So I definitely think that you have to get sales to shed that armor. So any way that you can also spend some quality time kind of working the field and getting those relationships back up and getting them to trust that you're doing a good job, that you understand what the qualification process is. And if you don't understand it, asking them why, right? What was the disconnect? Let's work on this, having that closed feedback loop with them, so that you can really, have an alignment or a mutual understanding of what the expectations of the job are, and then build that trust back up. And hopefully then everybody wins in the end.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think I can't stress that enough. Just the most important thing is to make sure everybody is aligned around how success is going to be measured by the SDR team, and also who owns it, right? In some organizations, marketing owns the SDR function. Some organizations, sales owns the function. And I think there's an argument to be made for both. Obviously there's a lot of variables, and it really depends on, where are they aligned? Is this an outbound motion? Is it an inbound motion? But regardless, I think there needs to be kind of a stakeholder on both sides, so that there can be a feedback loop, because inevitably, even if it's aligned under marketing, the leads are getting flipped over to sales. So we need to make sure, to your point, Jessica, that feedback loop, the SDRs are getting feedback on, what made this lead of good quality, where did it fall short, so we can continue to optimize. At the end of the day, the SDR is a lot of times the first person a prospect actually talks to, from your company, from your brand. So there's a lot of information that you can kind of glean from them. Obviously, on the marketing side, understanding what customers and prospects care about, what are they saying, what content and messaging are they responding to, that can help to then optimize your content strategy in the future and your campaign strategy in the future. And then obviously from the sales side, understanding, where are we getting the best conversion rates, by which persona, where, what sales rate, what AE is best at converting our leads into opportunities. And you want to get buy-in from both sides, because the minute sales feels like your leads aren't of good quality, they're going to disengage with the program. So I think building that confidence really quickly out of the gates, and making sure that those measures of success may be different in the first 3 months that you stand up an STR team versus sort of, the next 6 months of, and what does that look like at different time periods. But I think, those are all really good points.
I think to sum up the biggest points from what you both talked about, and I think this is sort of the meat of the conversation here as to how you can enable and empower your team, is through this idea of alignment. The real crux that a lot of organizations, I think, that we're talking about is sort of the negative aspect of this conversation, is that they don't look at the SDRs as anything more than just SDRs. They're there to send emails, make phone calls, give me numbers, pass leads. That's it. That's your job. Jessica, you alluded to it. Just huck stuff over the fence, and then whatever happens, happens. However, what you're both talking about, and what I want to touch on deeper, is this idea that the SDR function has this ability to align the organization through the qualitative metrics and information that they're gathering day to day on the phone. They are that boots on the ground level role. They are listening to what your prospects are saying on a daily basis, and then feeding that information back up to marketing, to leadership, to product, so you can make actual change within your organization, tweak messaging, tweak the way that you're positioned in the market, feed that back to SDRs, and they get better. It's a win-win type situation. So I guess tactically, I want to hear from you two how those feedback loops work, what you need to set up realistically to make sure that the information is getting indexed properly and being transferred from SDRs up to leadership, and what a well-run feedback loop means for that team. What do other departments gain from this? How can they all then work together towards a common goal? What's really required to make it happen? Kind kind of everything around that.
Yeah, no, that's a lot. So a couple of things.
Sorry for dumping a
Where
whole
to
lot on
begin?
you. Yeah.
Well,
Where
I
do we
think
start?
first off, I think making sure everyone is working in a common system, right? And there's sort of a single record of truth, whether that's your CRM, which it should be, or whatever sort of your whatever your tech stack is. Everybody needs to be there, and it needs all of the information that the SDRs are gathering needs to be sort of in a database that you can report on, so you kind of have access to this information, the market intelligence. I think a tactical way that you can get some feedback is, and I know a lot of SDR teams do this, where they'll pass over a lead to sales, and they'll actually sit in on that first discovery call with the account executive. And I think that's really valuable, especially in the first several months where the SDR is still learning. First of all, they can hear firsthand how the AE sort of navigates through a conversation, how they answer questions. It helps with their learning. But two, they can have, now they have more context when they debrief with their AE around, okay, yeah, he sounded interested, or, hey, that missed the mark. So they're there. And it also helps, right? Because the AE might say, all right, I'm going to kick this one back over to you to continue nurturing it. It's not quite ready. So that way things aren't falling through the cracks. So that's one tactical way that the SDR can have access to the information firsthand. And I think too, just making sure there's some process built where you are getting continual feedback from the sales team, whether that's on like a weekly call or that's some kind of survey format, where after each lead's passed, you're getting some kind of, measurement of how qualified the sales team felt that was, so you can kind of continue to optimize from the SDR standpoint. And then that will obviously help like understand what sales cares about, what they're going to get excited about. And then obviously we talked a little bit about, as the SDR team have more conversations, we'll be able to sort of start tracking trends and sort of common questions that are asked. And that will help inform marketing as well, as far as like, okay, these are the content pieces that prospects are most interested in.
They should be joining marketing meetings too, though, right? Like, it's not just sales meetings on a regular basis. They should be joining marketing meetings for exactly the reason.
Oh, for sure.
Is the quality of leads, the content that's resonating, what they're seeing in what they're seeing in their CRM versus what the conversations people are saying in their conversations. Like, are people actually being truthful on forms, right? So if you put a lot of time and effort into an integrated form strategy, and you're asking meaningful questions that are aligned to whatever that buying stage is that you're asking them during, right, then they should be giving you honest answers. But if you're getting different answers in your first call than you are seeing in the CRM, then that's telling you that there's some misalignment there, right? So maybe taking a step back then and looking at your form strategy. Are we asking disruptive things that are too early in the buying cycle for people to feel comfortable giving that kind of information? Or maybe we're not asking questions that are they're irrelevant, right? They're not helping somebody pre-qualify or a sales rep understand how to tailor the conversation appropriately. So those types of things are really valuable to marketing, other than just, the quality of the lead or the for content. All that is really important. You talked about before too, about measurement, right? So one of the things that we do with our clients is we put very granular conversion rate measurements in place. So we put the ability to measure conversion from what we call engaged, right? The first time that somebody engages with the company, all the way to a qualified lead, which is whatever the criteria you've aligned on with sales and marketing to deem that something is qualified. Yep. And then we measure the time that an SDR takes to receive that lead, start working it, and then either convert it to, as we most of the time work with stage 0 opportunities, right? So it's got no value. It's not in pipeline, but it's, but it's qualified, sales qualified. Some people call it sales qualified, whatever you want. So the time between then and the sales qualified lead, and then sales qualified to sales accepted, which is normally I've had a meeting. I think this person is qualified enough to work on them and move them in my active pipeline and report up to my boss that it's something, right? So having that granularity then, and being able to benchmark where you start, and then as you make those tweaks or optimizations to understand, which way you're moving up or down in each one of those stages, can really help you hone into on, is it an SDR problem? Is it a sales problem? A marketing problem, whatever it might be, so that you don't end up with that finger pointing where somebody's saying, sales is saying, oh, the leads are not
Yeah.
good, and marketing saying, I'm not going to open the pipes up and throw garbage at you because then you're not going to trust it, or you're not answering the leads or whatever, right? The SDR is kind of the truth sayer in the middle of it.
Yeah, I like that.
I can honestly say that I think that all of any program that we've put in place that has underperformed, you can directly relate it to either the lack of an SDR team or a poorly executed SDR team because of that. So
yeah, no, I think I like the point about looking at the different conversion rates, and that really does help you to diagnose where the problem is. Because and before you even start, like making sure the organization is really clear with how those stages are defined, because all organizations define them very differently. What an SAL is to one org is different than the next. So making sure everyone's really clear on what the definition is, how qualified a lead has to be to get to that next stage, and then measuring those conversion rates, right? Because if things are hitting a SAL, which is, I agree with you, right? They, maybe it's come through marketing and SDRs further qualified it, set up a meeting, the meeting happens. And if those aren't then getting converted to an opportunity at that stage, then there's a qualification problem, or we're going after the wrong accounts and the wrong prospects to start with. But if it's getting to an opportunity and then they're just not closing, then that might be a sales problem, or, something, with the product or whatever it is. So I think that that's really helpful, but first sort of figuring out what those stages are, defining those really clearly, and helping and looking at those conversion rates to help sort of diagnose problems.
absolutely.
And AJ, I don't know if we're answering your questions at all,
of course.
So
can you tell we're passionate about this?
Feel free to jump in and say, no, you completely,
no.
I'm like, what did he ask? What was the exact question again? It was a lot. There were a lot of pieces of questions. So I want to make sure that we're getting to all of the different parts.
Yeah, I definitely threw a lot at you for that one, and you did tackle it well. There was a lot of answers in there. I think one thing that I wanted to double down on, because you both mentioned it, and it was kind of the premise of the question originally, but around alignment specifically, you mentioned how a well-run SDR function, Jessica, to your point, they align everyone because they're all working towards the same thing. And if you have common language and if you have common metrics to measure that thing that sales and marketing and revenue and product and every revenue generating department can agree on, then you're trending in the right direction. You feel like you have a team that's really working in harmony with the other revenue generating departments. But if you have an SDR function that is somehow measured, their conversion rates are different than what sales is expecting, or you use SQOs and they use SALs, and it's like the language just isn't there, then there's automatically going to be barriers put up between the departments, and finger pointing starts to go from, well, sales isn't doing this and marketing isn't doing this, to, well, sales dev isn't on board. And typically they're the youngest, least experienced, most undervalued team, and then all of a sudden everyone's pointing fingers at them, and that's no good ever. I feel like they're the scapegoat at a ton of organizations. I guess that's what I was getting at.
You keep saying revenue generating, though. I don't want to lose sight of that, right? So it's not aligning around that first and foremost, and it's not activity metrics. We oftentimes go into organizations that are 100% activity based, volume. It's that churning activity out every day, and it's not meaningful activity necessarily, or sometimes, honestly, that's a key indicator that you're not providing, to go back to the title of this webinar, is that you're not empowering your SDRs, right, to have meaningful conversations. So they have to churn through quantity to get to something, rather than having less conversations, but more quality conversations, because you're empowering them to do their job correctly.
Right. And really, the objective, to your point, AJ, all should be aligned as an organization. It is to sort of drive revenue and introduce new customers to the brand, close new customers, and we should all be working together to do that. And I think back to sort of the KPIs and around alignment, also, talking about accountability and what team is accountable and responsible for what. So if, and really getting clear and articulating that to each department. So understanding if sales dev sits under marketing, what percentage of opportunity creation is marketing looking to be tied back to the SDR function, or as an account as a whole, as an organization as a whole, what percentage of revenue should be tied back to marketing and thus the SDR function versus, partners versus, direct sales. So I think that, and then you can kind of build a model around that as far as how large a team you need. And I think we've talked about this in other webinars about sort of capacity planning and things like that, but just really understanding what is the objective overall as an organization and what is my department responsible for, and how does that sort of work within the organization as a whole. And so that way it's like, what you own and what you're responsible for delivering.
Yeah, I think, and to build off of that, a question that I wanted to ask you both, I think sales dev, to your points before, know what they're responsible for. They're responsible for building these relationships with potential customers. They're more equipped to do that than any other department realistically. Marketing can pump out a ton of content. Sales can try and close people, but you have a sales dev team because you want to engage with people at the right people at the right time, educate them on your product, guide them through the buying cycle, and get them in front of someone when it makes sense to get them in front of somebody, not to just mass blast out a message.
Amen.
Or to, yeah, I guess this is in a perfect world.
That is true. And that is absolutely how it should be. But I think there's a lot of organizations, Jessica, to your point, that are still very focused on volume, book appointments. And then when I dig in and I ask, okay, well, so what are your conversion rates from these appointments? Only 50% are showing up to a first call, but like, for whatever reason, the metric that marketing is getting measured on, and therefore sales development, is like sort of around this appointment number. And I feel like we're stuck in that sometimes versus what Jessica, you said, which is really around, opportunity creation and alignment and quality. And, I can send you 50 appointments, but if none of them are with the right prospect or persona, and, 50% of them don't show up, you're not gonna be too happy. So
yeah,
I think that's
fair. And I think that it kind of starts from the top, right? And I want to ask the question then, you want your SDR team to be setting up these and building these relationships with the right people. You want them to really make sure that, yes, you have some type of volume associated with it, but there needs to be a quality of that product. As leadership, how can you enable and empower your SDRs to build these relationships now, almost fully digitally at this point, with the right people without then sacrificing enough on the volume side of things, where maybe your boss's boss's boss isn't then breathing down your neck saying, we're at 80% of our total activity metrics. What gives?
Yeah, no, I think that's really a tough part, because there is a quality and quantity, obviously, aspect to this. You can't just make 5 calls over the course of the week and personalize the hell out of the messaging and expect to be successful. But you doing 150 calls and not thinking about who you're calling and what you're doing isn't going to be successful either. So I think really, coming up with sort of what the measures of success are, I think, and we talked about this in a webinar, I think we did a couple months ago. In my eyes, an SDR team should be measured on the number of qualified discovery calls they're setting up, right? So, those appointments that happen, and then how many of those are converting to actionable opportunities, so that you're not just incentivizing them to hit some sort of appointment number, but you're also incentivizing them to uncover the right leads with the right people. So that's definitely, aligning on incentive and compensation plans is one way to sort of do it, I think, AJ, to help with that. I don't know.
You said something interesting in there, though. You talked about being able to personalize, right? And the balance between quality and quantity. I think that's part of it too, is that you need to be able to, there's a million pieces in every marketing and tech stack today that you can bring in and gives you data. Data is everywhere, right? But data is one thing. Actionable insight is another. So if you can create something that's more scalable for SDRs to be able to personalize, quality and quantity can go hand in hand, right? So it doesn't have to be a numbers game, and you're not also spending an hour and a half researching. So if you can take data and you can, point to actionable insights that SDRs understand, okay, we have all this information again that they've given me already, right? They've told me hopefully what their biggest challenge is. They've read all of these pieces of content or engaged in this webinar or done this thing. So how do we bring all of that together and have a conversation with somebody so you're not starting from scratch? That's the problem that I see with a lot of poorly run SDR teams too, right? Not to, I know you didn't ask this, I'm going back to topics, but is that people, right? They start the conversations over to a certain degree, right? Because again, that quality quantity balance gets out of whack, right? And so, but I think again, that's leadership's responsibility, right? You need to tie your systems. You know, it's great that you have all of these tools and technologies available to empower SDRs, but don't expect them to log into 10 different systems, you know, over the course of 2 hours and then cobble all of that data together into something meaningful. They're not, you know, I mean, at that point you might as well just start over or go to LinkedIn. So you know, you have a responsibility to put all of that together and enable them in a way to have those conversations, because buyers expect that today. We all know that, right? It's the age old, everyone always expects you to know things about them. They've given you information, but now more than ever, because like you said, AJ, the digital aspect, like the digital piece of that conversation is going so much farther now. And they've had so many more interactions with you and answered so many more questions that you should, they know you're tracking them and you should have all that information, right? And not also saying, hey, I saw you read this content piece. What do you think about it? Right. But really take a couple of minutes and read that content piece. What's it about? Why did they read it 5 times? Right? Something hit them. So have that organic conversation and just talk to them like a person.
Yeah.
That is sorely missed. I think in a lot of the interactions that sales rep have with people is that you're talking to a person, right? That's another human being on the other end.
That's at the end of the day what it is. And I think tools can be like teams can be like over-tooled. We've talked about this too, AJ, right? Like where they have every sales enablement tool under the sun and it almost makes them paralyzed, right? There's a happy medium of making sure that they have tools in place to help them hit those activity metrics where they're still, you know, and help them personalize the messaging without it being paralyzing and overwhelming.
Absolutely. Yeah. Technology is an enabler, but that goes back to process, right? You can't replace a lack of process with a tool or a piece of technology. So
well, you know,
try.
I've seen it try. It's interesting. I forget who said this, but I remembered somebody saying it and I wrote it down a while ago and I've just kind of kept it in a notebook. But Jessica, to your point, people are injecting themselves into buying cycles at way deeper down the funnel than they ever have been before, just based on the amount of information available. Even if they don't like inbound in a traditional sense, if somebody reaches out outbound, there's a chance that like that person already knows about your company, your product, who you are, what you do, just because that information is available out there. And the quote is, you don't go to a car dealership to educate yourself, you go to confirm the research you've done. So more often than not, when someone does come to you, they already have an idea of how can this possibly help me? Yeah, I need you to validate my opinion. And when an SDR does try to start that conversation over, it's very deflating. I, as a potential buyer, don't want to have a discovery call when I've technically done all the discovery by myself. Exactly. So there's something to be said about an SDR recognizing that, but to the point of the webinar, how can leadership then communicate that to their SDRs? Because once you start getting a very large team and you have hundreds and thousands of inbounds coming in and you just start worrying about, can I handle all of these? Do I have a large enough team to tackle the amount of inbound requests that we have? Some of that process can fly out the window. It happens.
Yeah.
What can you do to sort of continually make sure that your SDRs are getting the resources that they need to ensure that they actually reach out to these people with that in mind, knowing that they're deeper down the funnel, that they don't need a reintroduction to the service, that there's something to be said around I'm here to help versus I'm here to educate you on my product.
Yeah, I mean, so I think first off, making sure that you have that manager and training layer in place to help the SDRs, you know, kind of learn how to do that and how to best navigate the tools that they have in place is going to be really helpful, and understanding sort of what the KPIs that you're going to use to measure that. Because you're right, AJ, I think, you know, process can go out the window when all of a sudden you have a campaign that's generated 500 leads and all of a sudden you have to scramble and like everything that you've done is out the window. So making sure you have good leadership in place that's going to be able to sort of guide the SDRs towards sort of what you want them to do, what you need them to do, and that they're kind of adhering to a process there. I think is the first piece of it.
Having a funnel management framework as well that enables you to prioritize effectively, like having a good scoring model in place, and really understanding that scoring model has been that was something that was aligned on between sales and marketing, and you really understand what makes somebody more attractive or interesting. And keep in mind, I'm not talking about hand raisers, right? That's easy, right? Somebody's literally filling a contact form out and saying, I want to talk to sales. Great. Let me talk to you. But I'm just talking about more people that through behaviors or interaction are positioned and looking like they're likely or have a high intent to buy, right? Those types of organizations, those are the people that you need to triage, especially like you said, if they're coming off of a big campaign, right? And all of a sudden you have this mass influx of leads, you've got to have a way to prioritize those. Right. And if it's a way to prioritize them that's been predetermined by sales and marketing to be, what they want to see, then you should be okay, because then you're hitting things in the order that they should be coming in.
Right. I think ways to prioritize leads in some type of scoring system so that it's not just, like just attacking them all the exact same way. Right?
And you can, and not just demographic either, by the way. So we see a lot of scoring models that are simply demographic, right? Like we have some organizations we've worked with that are like C-suite or bust, right? We only talk to the C-suite. Well, you're going to have 5 conversations then, because the CEO is not the one that's out there doing the research on a new product or service, right? They're going to their lieutenant, whoever they trust in the organization, and saying, hey, we have this challenge, or maybe they're not, right? And that person says, we have this challenge. I'm going to go out, instead of bringing a problem to my decision maker, I'm going to bring a solution. So they're doing all of that research themselves. And so those are the people sometimes that are coming in. And so we see a lot of organizations that are stuck around when they think about what their ICP is or who the decision maker is. They're too narrowly focused on the end decision maker, the person that signs a check or SOW or something like that, rather than the person that's initiating that buying process, who's going to be the one to draft you up to the decision maker, right? And who's that key lieutenant to whoever it might be that you're eventually going to do the selling to. But again, not the SDR, the salesperson is. So the SDR can easily talk to that person, get an understanding of the pains. And oftentimes that person's more willing to be a little more open.
I was going to say they're 100%. A treasure trove of information.
And you can use that information when you ultimately have conversations with the C-suite, right? And you'll just sound much more informed and you'll be more confident around the message to them. So
it's like a first call therapy session is what Nathan and I always call like our first call. Sometimes people come in and like after an hour, people go, wow, that felt good. Oof. We're like, great, thank you.
Big weight off my shoulders.
And, AJ, you brought up something around, obviously buyers these days are coming into the sales funnel so much more educated, right, than before, because there's just so many resources available to them. But a lot of times, we'll work with organizations that are maybe just going to market, or they're sort of creating a new market. And so there may not be a lot of materials out there. And so the SDRs do have to educate prospects, right? So there are, times where that is the case, and maybe a win is just getting a prospect to agree to learn more versus maybe a more established company and a more established market. You're getting somebody who's already researched 8 of your competitors, and you need to be able to kind of qualify them a little bit differently. So be aware of that too, I guess, as SDRs.
And that goes back to alignment, like we talked about, because if SDRs are expected to, I'm not going to try and say the word either, educate your prospects, and the goal really there is to have a good conversation and get some solid notes out of it. And then the sales leadership is like, where are all of our meetings? That misalignment then is, again, finger pointing back to SDRs, like you're not doing your job. And it's like, our job kind of is this though. Like we're just not working towards the same thing.
And you're seeing a lot, you're seeing a lot more of that now too, though, coming out of the pandemic, right? Because I think so many organizations had to pivot their go-to-market, right? So we see a lot of people coming in right now that say, I have this challenge. I think you're a fit. I don't know, but my go-to-market has to radically pivot right now, right? Because of just the way people do business today. so they need help with that. So oftentimes they're coming in, they don't know a lot about, but they'll be reading thought leadership content or on our website or attending webinars, right? And they say, wow, you sound like something I hear myself in what you're saying, but I don't necessarily know what that solution is or how you do that. So, we're seeing a lot more of that. That's a big trend lately.
And I know, AJ, there's a few questions that have come in, so I want to make sure we have enough time for all of that as
You're
well.
doing my job for me, Lindsay. This is
Okay.
great. I did want to wrap up with, I guess final thoughts from the two of you in terms of if somebody were to ask you, how do I convince, maybe is the right word, or how do I start to make this process happen at my organization? How can I get leadership to buy in at the fact that we need to enable our SDRs, that they're more valuable than we thought? I guess one big piece of advice from the two of you, and then we can start tackling some of the questions in the chat.
I mean, number one, look at the data, right? So understanding the increase in conversion rates when you do have an SDR team versus when you don't. So better marketing return on investment, because SDRs are going to be better able to efficiently and effectively convert those marketing leads that are coming through. So more of those will make it over to sales. And also I would say, try to, because you want to tie it back to some kind of number, right? So equate the time savings, from your sales team, if they no longer have to do their own prospecting, and they can then now focus on opportunities that are further down the funnel than having to work on sort of top of funnel opportunities, and they're not going to do the right work on that. So sort of the cost savings there. I mean, I talk to a lot of organizations that would rather hold off on hiring more AEs and instead build out an SDR team to support fewer AEs. And that may be more cost effective for them, and honestly more effective in general.
I would have said almost exactly the same thing. It's numbers. It's by the numbers, seriously, because most of the times you're going to have to go and you're going to have to justify this against other investments for the organization at the CFO level, right? Because it's not cheap, because you have to put the structure in place. And normally it's not just headcount, but it's the process or the framework or all these other things we've talked about, right? So I think that, understanding where you're at today, benchmarking where you're at with enough granularity that you can, measure moving forward against things, even if it's simple, like response times to net new leads, right? And that's a simple low-hanging fruit, just improving things like that. Sales velocity, conversion rates, like you said, right? But understanding an idea of where you are today and where your target is tomorrow. And then also running quantitative modeling is one thing we do with a lot of our clients out the gate. So, going back to something you said, Lindsay, in the beginning, but what are your goals as an organization? What is marketing's contribution to those revenue goals? And what's it going to take to get there? Because guess what? It's not going to be 5 leads, right? Normally it's a significant uptick with what you're processing today, and everybody can align around the fact that you're going to need a sustainable, repeatable model to do something like that. So we do a lot of quantitative modeling out the front, because again, at the end of the day, that's also speaking the CFO's language.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Love it.
Left you with 9 minutes, AJ.
Hey, that's plenty of time. We can tackle some of these questions. I'm gonna pick and choose a couple in here that I think are going to drive the juiciest conversation. Let's see. So here's a good one. We talked a lot about, enabling and empowering SDRs. Sales is full of ebbs and flows, right? You can book 35 meetings 1 month and 0. Well, maybe not 0 the next. Probably a huge issue if that's the case. But it's a roller coaster, and inevitably SDRs will be in a slump or a dry spell of some kind. Yeah. There are plenty of ways that they can kind of dig themselves out of that or leverage their peers to do so. But from a leadership perspective, how do you recognize that is happening before it becomes an issue? And then how can you help? We've talked about coaching and managing before. How can you help that SDR dig themselves out of that rut and get them back on track?
No, it's part of the SDR role, right? AJ, you know it all too well from back in the day. I think sales, there's certainly ebbs and flows. So a couple things, it is definitely helpful when you have the luxury of having sort of a larger team where there's that camaraderie and there's that engagement among peers, because they can each sort of help each other out and give each other a pat on the back or commiserate when necessary. having an effective leader and an effective manager who can also sort of notice if somebody is getting frustrated or there's a lack of engagement, understanding that it inevitably happens, that there will be sort of dry spells throughout the role. But I think in order to kind of curtail that, or even things out a little bit, you have to always be, you can't sort of rest on your laurels when you've had sort of a good couple weeks. So what I see happen a lot is, let's say an SDR their goal is to get 8 qualified leads a month, and they hit their 8 and there's 5 days left in the month, and they are rightfully so happy. They've hit their goal. They're going to have a good comp check. They've worked really hard, and it's hard. It's hard to cold call. It's hard to pick up the phone over and over. It's hard to deal with the rejection. Sometimes it is not easy. It is the hardest part of sales. Being an AE is far easier than being an SDR in my mind. That's why AEs don't want to do it anymore. And that's why that we need SDRs, and it's a different role and a different skill set. But I think if you have had a good month, and just don't take your eye off of, don't sort of take your eye off the ball, right? It's like, great, I hit my goal, got to start prospecting because I have to set myself up for the next month. The minute you sort of kick back and say, okay, great, I can take a couple days off. You certainly should take vacation, but I'm saying, like, you know what I mean? Like, I can like pare down on the activity. That's when you're on, like, I think when you're on a hot streak, you've hit your goal, that's exactly the time when you should be making more calls and talking to more prospects, because you're sort of, you're in the right mindset. So that would be my advice, is that yes, it happens. It's great if you can kind of commiserate with some peers and talk about what's worked for maybe some top SDRs at the organization. So always go to people that are a pace setter and ask them what they've done to be successful is always a great tip. And then just, if you're on a roll, you're hitting goal, keep going, because you need to set yourself up for the next month.
I would just ask too. I think with people working remotely right now, part of the challenge is lack of visibility into understanding if people are doing okay or not, right? Just ask. Again, it goes back to that people piece of this whole thing. Even if you think people have a smile on their face, they could hang up with you and slump down on their chair. You don't know.
Sob uncontrollably.
Or yeah.
No, it's tough, right? And it's hard. It was easier when, in a way, right, we were all in offices together and you could sort of chat with your friend and hear everyone on the phone. We don't have that luxury, and hopefully, people start going back into offices, but I think it's forever changed in a way.
How many people have you hired this over the pandemic, right? That before the first time you all got together, you had never met them in person, right? So you don't understand their body language. You don't understand just how they operate. And that's something, by the way, talk about, an SDR, we should give everybody props the last 2 years, because you don't have the advantage of body language or in-person interaction with people. Yeah, it's
being in your house making cold calls. Like I wouldn't have been able to. I wouldn't have lasted.
But yeah, so I would say just ask people how they're doing, and make people comfortable with not being okay and expressing the fact that they're not doing okay, because it could have nothing to do with the job either. By the way, they're having a great month and still not be okay.
That's a good point. Another good question that rolled in that I definitely wanted to have you two tackle. How do you find the middle ground when switching from activity and volume-based metrics for SDRs to those more quality-based metrics? You can have all the data and know what to measure, but how do you then strike that balance when you're making that change as an organization? Because it can't all happen at once, right? Like you can't be just an activity-focused shop one day and the next day say, hey, 150 activities, throw it out the window. I just want conversations. That's got to be a tough process to manage.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes back to analyzing the data, right? So the first thing I do is understand what is the connection rate for whatever, whatever the company is that you're an SDR for. So if it's, 10%, you have 10 meaningful connections with every 100 outbound activities, what your conversion off of a connection is. And sort of, you can do the math to figure out where that sweet spot is, because you should be looking for, to convert somewhere between 4 to 7% of all your connections into a handoff, and those handoffs, those handoffs should convert, 40 to 70% of them should convert to an opportunity, depending on, a couple different variables. And I think, no, it doesn't happen overnight. And that's why both things should be measured. It's not as if you stop measuring activity and now you're just measuring.
You both have a place. Yeah.
Activity drives opportunity. You can't, all of that is going to drive the down funnel activity. Like it's not like you just stop making calls and focus on quality and it just won't work. But it's where is that point of diminishing return, and sort of analyzing the data and figuring out what that needs to be in order to hit your goals as an organization, in order to hit your, revenue goals, looking at your sales cycle, looking at your conversion rates, will certainly help. But I don't think it's a one or the other.
100%. I think, yeah, when you understand what you're aligning around as an organization is your North Star KPI, which is hopefully revenue, right? But then, but when things aren't working or are working, then you dig into the activity to understand why, right? So that you can optimize whether you're doing more of what's working or doing less of what you're doing because it's not working. But so you need both of them, and you need to be able to report up or report down. Oftentimes it's just about introducing the more revenue-based KPIs to an SDR team, because they don't even have visibility into those sometimes. Again, it goes back to compartmentalizing SDR teams into whatever they're doing and not taking off the blinders and enabling them to understand what comes before their job and what comes after their job, right?
That's a really good point. And I think to that point too, you need to have an organization that's like okay with testing and figuring it out and getting to that point where you can find the point of diminishing returns. And it might mean that you're not having maybe the most consistent level of results on a daily basis, but you're working towards finding that almost like true level of output for your team where, hey, maybe we're dropping our activities by 30 every week, but we're increasing our conversations by 15. Totally. And we tried dropping it by 40, but it only increased it by 6, and that wasn't enough. Like you have to you have to benchmark stuff. You have to use the data. You have to test, and everyone's got to buy in on it. Because if your team is testing and leadership's like, "Hey, what are you doing? We're not seeing consistent results," goes back to that alignment issue.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, it is 3:00. I don't want to take up any more of anyone else's time. I thought this was a fantastic discussion. Thank you both, Lindsay and Jessica, for being here. If people want to get in touch with you, learn more about demandDrive or ANNUITAS, where can they find you, Lindsay? We can start with you.
Yeah, so certainly on LinkedIn, and I don't know if you want me to rattle off my email address, but I can.
Whatever you're comfortable with.
I can chat it. I can put it in the chat right now. One question I had, the questions that we didn't get to answer, I don't know if AJ, you're going to pull all of those and have.
Yeah, we can save the chat. Yeah, okay. I can send it if you both want. I can send it to the two of you and have you answer them separately, and we can shoot them over to the people who asked them.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I've just chatted everybody my email, so you know where to find me.
Fair, I'll do the same. How's that? Okay, perfect. But yeah, for us, you can go to ANNUITAS.com. We've got lots and lots of content out there. We just launched our podcast as well. And actually one of the inaugural episodes was about, how to empower your SDRs, right? And how to translate online conversation into, meaningful conversation with your prospect. So, lots of great stuff out there. We have a blog as well. Anytime, go out there, we're putting everything out every week. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Sweet. Well, thank you both again for being here. Thank everyone in the audience for showing up today and asking great questions. We'll make sure to get the recordings out and answer these questions and get them over to you as well.
Okay,
awesome.
Sounds good. All right.
Thanks everyone.
Jessica. Nice seeing you. All right. Bye, AJ. Thanks, guys.
Bye, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for checking out this webinar with demandDrive and ANNUITAS. Make sure to subscribe to get more content like this. And if you feel bold, check out some of our other content right now.